Putin has a secret bridge to Iran, not a road or railway, but a shipping route across the Caspian Sea that carries cargo from Iran's northern ports deep into Russia. For the past 4 years, this shadow route has carried weapons between Tehran and Moscow, beyond the reach of Western sanctions. But on the night of July 25th, Kiev's long-range drones crossed thousands of kilometers and brought the war directly onto that bridge. Russia and Iran had treated the Caspian like a sealed vault, isolated by geography and beyond anyone's reach. But watch what happened when Ukrainian drones cut across the Caspian night. The vault became a glass display case. Every ship hiding inside was suddenly visible and reachable. Then the transport ships began taking hits at their berths, the same vessels responsible for moving military equipment between Tehran and Moscow. The result? 4 strategic targets wiped out. The bitterest blow was the destruction of the Caspian flotilla's only missile ship of its class. Moscow had deployed it to Project Power. Now it was scrap metal. But here is the part that made the Kremlin sweat. The military damage was the smaller problem. The political fallout was the real nightmare. Moscow's failure sent Tehran into panic. Iran had just watched the sea it considered safest become a strike zone, and its Russian ally failed to protect itself. Tehran immediately threatened retaliatory strikes against Kyiv. But before Tehran could act, Zelensky dropped a second bombshell, evidence that Russia was providing satellite targeting support for Iranian strikes on American troops. One night, 2 bombs. One ripped open the logistics network. The other tore away the diplomatic mask. The Kremlin had no answer ready for either. The 4 targets struck on July 25th were not random dots on the Caspian map. Take a closer look. Ukraine was dissecting an entire shadow network, taking it apart, one carefully selected node at a time. The first link was money. Out in the dark, Caspian, the Filanovsky oil platform stood above the largest oil field in Russia's sector of the sea, pumping out roughly 6 million metric tons of black gold a year. It doesn't launch missiles, it doesn't carry ammunition, and unlike a ship, it can't run. But the oil revenue it generates keeps Moscow's war machine funded. Farther north, the hunt shifted to Port Olya II, a cargo ship sanctioned by the United States, the United Kingdom, and Ukraine. The vessel belongs to MG Flot, a company linked to businessman Jamaluddin Pashayev. Remember that name. Behind him is not just one ship, but an entire covert shipping network Ukraine has only begun to unravel. But to move weapons through this corridor, Moscow needed ghosts. That is where Beghi entered the file. On the surface, it looked completely harmless, a routine dry cargo vessel. But each time it approached Iran's port of Amirabad, its AIS beacon, the signal broadcasting the ship's identity and position, vanished from ship tracking maps. Beghi erased its name, position, and route, slipping across the Caspian like a ship that did not exist. By the time it reappeared on the Russian side, its holds were packed with artillery shells, body armor, and helmets. Ukraine was not finished with the Caspian's floating trucks. Wherever secret cargo moves, someone has to guard it. That night, the guard was Molniya, a Project 12,418 missile boat armed with 8 Kh-35 Uran anti-ship missiles with a range of up to 260 kilometers. It was built to detect, lock onto, and sink enemy warships from beyond the horizon. Open any naval warfare textbook and the rule is simple. To neutralize one fleet, you send another fleet against it. But Kyiv had just rewritten the rulebook. It turned the Caspian into a chessboard unlike any other. Russia had the rooks, knights, and every major piece on the water. Ukraine's side was almost empty, yet Moscow still ended up in checkmate. With the cargo ships, Kyiv shattered the confidence of Russia's logistics command. With Molniya, it stripped the Russian Navy of its arrogance. And with the oil platform burning, it drove the blade straight into the Kremlin's energy cash box. 3 separate messages. 1 iron declaration. No fortress on this sea remained untouchable. From that night on, every commercial voyage across the Caspian would carry a crippling protection bill. Now look at Tehran's response. The Security Service of Ukraine released a list of 4 targets. Not one flew the Iranian flag. Every target on that list was Russian. Yet only hours later, Tehran rushed into the spotlight. It announced that one of its sailors had been killed aboard an Iranian commercial vessel, even though Kyiv had never identified any of the targets as Iranian. The mask was barely in place before Tehran's own statement tore it off. There are only two explanations, and both doors open into the same room of bitter irony. Either Iran staged the story to cast itself as the victim before an international audience, or the truth is even worse. Tehran did not even know what its own merchant ships were doing on the shadow route. A government that cannot say where its ships are, what they are carrying, or why they are on fire sounds less like a regional power and more like an accounting office that has lost all its books. And before the smoke over the Caspian had cleared, the second bomb went off, the secret held back from the beginning of the story. Kyiv released its evidence. Since early July, Russian military satellites had repeatedly scanned U.S. bases across the Gulf like eyes that never blinked. On July 19th and 20th, imagery of 4 strategic U.S. bases in Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait went straight into Iranian hands. The timing matched strikes targeting American troops. Kyiv had pulled back the curtain on a secret both Moscow and Tehran had worked to conceal. Russia was not merely sitting in the stands and cheering. Moscow was Tehran's all-seeing eye in the sky, feeding it, targeting data for strikes against American troops. The Pentagon may have responded cautiously, but the allegation alone was enough to keep the lights burning in Washington's corridors of power and the doors to emergency meeting rooms firmly shut. This was a two-way pipeline carrying war in both directions. Iran pumped artillery shells and Shahed drones north into Putin's war machine. In return, Russia pushed satellite targeting data south to Tehran. One side supplied the fist, the other provided the eyes. But Ukraine's move carried an even deeper strategic meaning. Kyiv had just handed Washington what U.S. intelligence had long lacked: grounds to act on long-held suspicions. Ukraine dragged those suspicions out of the shadows and placed them under a spotlight, right on the board Moscow and Tehran thought they controlled. In a single night, the Kremlin did not just lose a prized warship beneath the Caspian. It also lost its most carefully crafted diplomatic mask. For an empire that prides itself on pulling strings in the shadows, there is no greater disaster than being dragged center stage just as every spotlight comes on. The Kremlin's untouchable sea had been cracking piece by piece for 20 months. Ukraine patiently removed one brick after another from the Caspian Wall, and the July 25th strike was simply the finishing blow in a hunt 20 months in the making. The irony? In 2018, all 5 countries bordering the Caspian signed a treaty barring foreign forces. On paper, they had turned it into one of the most tightly sealed seas in the world. But drones don't need passports to cross walls built from diplomatic ink. Milestone 1, November 2024. Kyiv left the first crack in the Caspian door, proving that Russia's fleet was still within reach. The destroyers Tatarstan and Dagestan were struck at their berths, the first time Ukrainian drones had ignited explosions inside what Moscow considered the safest room in its strategic rear. Milestone 2, August through December 2025. Moscow saw the crack but ignored the warning. Ukraine gradually dragged the Iran-Russia logistics corridor out of the shadows and then hit it link by link. In August, Port Olya 4 sank in port. 4 months later, the Filanovsky oil platform was struck 3 times in a single week. Before the smoke from one strike had cleared, the next blow landed on the same wound. By then, the Caspian had become a room crawling with insects carrying explosives. They poured out of every crack while Moscow fumbled for the bug spray. Milestone 3, the night of July 25th. The first 2 lessons came together in one coordinated strike. Ukraine moved from hunting 1 target at a time to striking 4 at once. Transport ships, energy infrastructure, and even the Caspian flotilla's prized missile boat all entered the crosshairs. For 20 months, Ukraine had followed the trail, tested the prey's reactions, and tightened the ring with each new strike. By July 25th, the Caspian had stopped being a sanctuary. It had become a sealed trap. And this was about more than losing a quiet sanctuary. The Caspian flotilla had also launched Caliber cruise missiles, the same weapons that had rained down on Ukrainian cities for years. Moscow is now forced to deploy more air defenses, reroute shipping, and double security around a sea it once barely had to think about. Remember the name Pashayev from earlier? Even the name Port Olia II is a clue in this web. Its name points directly to the port of Olia, Russia's strategic gateway on the north-south transport corridor to Iran. Pashayev controlled the vessel through MG Flot. He also owned Navigator LLC, a company contracted directly by the Russian Defense Ministry to organize military maritime transport. The harder you pull on the Pashayev thread, the more of the web comes into view. One name ran through the entire shadow network, from ships and ports to secret contracts with the Kremlin. Ukrainian intelligence now held the map to a maze no outsider was supposed to enter, and it could read every passage inside. When the Caspian route carrying artillery shells and drone components is severed, the pain travels instantly through the logistics nervous system, all the way to the front lines in Donbass and Kursk. This is a military delivery chain stretching thousands of kilometers. Ukraine just left it a one-star review with a warhead. Zoom out, and that punch is now tearing through Moscow's economic blueprint. For 30 years, Russia had planned to turn the port of Olia into a massive logistics gateway built to route trade around sanctions. Now Ukrainian drones have drawn a red slash through that blueprint, sending Moscow back to page 1. The lesson from the Black Sea is still fresh and still expensive. A single strike can send war risk insurance premiums soaring, tacking tens of thousands of dollars onto the bill for every voyage across the Caspian. And the ripples from this strike are already reaching other shores. Kyiv had already struck the nearby CPC pipeline, a route carrying Kazakh oil with American energy companies involved. That attack was a warning flare fired over the Caspian. These waters were no longer calm for anyone passing through. Russia once believed this route was cheap because it was hidden in the shadows. The route still exists, but every shipment moving through it will now be costlier, slower, and far more dangerous. Once the lights come on, every link, every risk, and every number on the invoice becomes visible. Darkness helped Moscow hide the route. The light sends Moscow the bill. The economic damage was only one layer. Tehran was now dealing with two exposures at once. Its connection to the ship had been revealed, and it had been dragged into the satellite scandal involving the United States. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi declared that the incident cannot be allowed to pass, then blamed Israel directly, accusing the country of provoking the incident to drag Europe into their war. Iranian lawmaker Ebrahim Azizi, who chairs Parliament's National Security Committee, warned that Kyiv would pay the price. He called the strike a miscalculation. Tehran summoned Ukraine's chargé d'affaires and took the issue directly to the United Nations Security Council. On the same day, it called both Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas. That sounds like a government preparing to act decisively. The problem is that Iran is also being strangled by the U.S. Navy in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. Just days earlier, U.S. naval forces had forced 12 vessels to change course, disabled 2, and boarded 2 more for inspections in Iran's own waters. A government struggling under a blockade in its own backyard has few options left but to shout through diplomatic channels. Tehran was scrambling for a backer because it had run out of cards of its own. But the most important detail was not on the surface of the Caspian. It was on the flight path to Washington. That same week, Zelensky flew to the United States to meet Trump. Put the timing of the Caspian strike beside the satellite dossier, and both take on an entirely different meaning. Seen as a negotiation, the timing becomes even clearer. Before entering the room with the President of the United States, Zelensky carried exactly two things: evidence that Russia and Iran were working together to target American troops, and proof that Ukraine was the only side willing to expose it publicly. This was no longer simply a military operation. It was a business card designed for the table in Washington, delivered on the right day, at the right hour. On the surface, this looked like a story about a distant sea between Russia and Iran that few people paid attention to. But the real story was unfolding inside a meeting in Washington. The Kremlin's name had just been called, and Moscow did not even have a seat at the table to defend itself. The Kremlin's final illusion of strategic depth had shattered on the very sea it once considered untouchable. One night, 2 bombs, and a defensive system now strangling itself. That is what July 25th left Moscow. What do you think? Does Iran have the nerve to retaliate, or will this end with nothing more than diplomatic letters? Since the night of July 25th, every ship leaving an Iranian port and heading north no longer enters a safe corridor. It enters a hunt, and this time there is no Molnia left to guard it.